midst of the deepest, darkest woods where silence reigns and shadows whisper, there's a place where no one should ever wander. This is the tale of a man who, in search of peace and solitude, unknowingly stumbled upon something far more terrifying. Welcome to the world of the Whispering Shadows, a place where the past isn't buried and the forest hides more than just trees. Tonight we take a step into the unknown, and you'll never want to leave the light again. I've been driving for Lyft for a few years now. I've had my fair share of strange passengers, drunk businessmen mumbling about deals gone wrong, couples arguing in the backseat, people who stare out the window and never say a word. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to what happened one cold winter night. It was nearly midnight and I was about to call it a night when a ride request popped up. The location? A desolate stretch of road at the edge of town, just before the highway cut into the woods. I hesitated. That area wasn't residential, there were no bars, no businesses, just an old service road that led to nowhere. But the fare was good, and I needed the money. So, I accepted. As I drove towards the pickup location, the city lights faded behind me, replaced by long, winding roads and towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark sky. My car's headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had started rolling in. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until all I could hear was the hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of branches swaying in the wind. When I arrived, the place was eerily silent. A single streetlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows on the cracked pavement. Under its dim glow stood a tall, thin man wrapped in an old black coat. His face was pale, his features sharp and angular, his lips colorless. But it was his eyes that made my stomach clench. They weren't just dark. They glowed faintly like the reflection of an animal's eyes in headlights. I hesitated. Something about him felt wrong. Still, I unlocked the doors. He slid into the back seat without a word. As soon as he entered, the temperature inside the car dropped. My heater was on full blast, but it suddenly felt like I was driving with the windows down in the dead of winter. I cleared my throat. Cold night, huh? Silence. He just sat there, his gaze not on me but on the empty passenger seat beside me. His lips moved slightly like he was whispering to someone. A chill ran down my spine. I forced a laugh. So, where are you headed? This time, he spoke, but his voice was barely above a whisper. Old mill factory. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. That place had been abandoned for decades. No one had any reason to go there, especially not at midnight. But I didn't argue. I just started driving. The silence was unbearable. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. He was still staring at the passenger seat, his fingers moving slightly like he was counting something invisible. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. If someone dies and no one is there to witness it, did they ever exist? My mouth went dry. I forced a chuckle. That's a deep question. He smiled, a small, unsettling curl of his lips. So many people vanish. Some are forgotten. Some were never really here. I didn't know what to say to that. The air inside the car felt thick, heavy. My hands were clammy against the wheel. I tried to keep my focus on the road, but I could feel him watching me now. We were getting closer to the factory, and with every mile, the temperature inside the car dropped lower. The factory loomed ahead, an empty, skeletal structure, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring at us. I slowed to a stop, my heart pounding. The man opened the door but didn't step out. Instead, he leaned forward, his breath icy against my neck. You should leave now. I didn't wait. I hit the gas and sped away, my pulse hammering in my ears. But just before I turned the corner, I made the mistake of checking my rearview mirror one last time. He was still standing there, watching me. And then, he vanished. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling. I searched online for anything about the factory, and what I found made my blood run cold. Years ago, a man had been brutally murdered there. The case was never solved, The killer was never found. I clicked on an old news article, and there it was, his photo, the man I had driven, the one who disappeared. He had been dead for 20 years. Imagine finding a cabin in the woods far from civilization, where the only sounds you hear are the whispers of the trees. It seems like paradise at first, but what happens when the quiet isn't the only thing lurking in the shadows? The cabin in the woods tells the chilling story of one man's encounter with something that shouldn't exist, a nightmare made real. Buckle up, because this is a journey you'll wish you never took. I've always preferred solitude. The noise of the city grates on me and people exhaust me, so when I found a small, isolated cabin deep in the Oregon wilderness, it felt perfect. A few miles from the nearest town, surrounded by towering trees and thick underbrush, it was exactly what I needed. No neighbors, no distractions. Just me, the forest, and silence. For the first week, everything was peaceful. I spent my days hiking, reading, and chopping wood for the small fireplace inside. The crisp mountain air, the distant sounds of birds, and the occasional rustling of deer in the underbrush. It was paradise. But on the 6th night, things changed. I woke up to footsteps. It was just past 3 a.m. A soft crunch outside, like someone stepping lightly on dried leaves. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. My cabin was in the middle of nowhere. There shouldn't be anyone outside. I crept toward the window, heart hammering, and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The moon was bright, casting silver light over the yard. The wind was still, the trees motionless. At first, I saw nothing. Then my stomach clenched. Footprints, hundreds of them. They weren't there when I went to bed. Bare footprints, small ones, littering the dirt outside, circling the cabin. Some led up to the front steps. Some stopped right outside my bedroom window. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line, but nothing moved. Just shadows stretching long and thin under the moonlight. I barely slept that night. The next day I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had been too tired the night before to notice them. Maybe animals. But the prints were human-shaped. Small, like children's. I shook it off. That night I stayed up. I left a single lamp on and sat by the window waiting. Hours passed. The woods were quiet save for the occasional chirp of crickets. Then around 2 a.m., laughter. Soft, childlike. I froze. It wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from my porch. I gripped my flashlight, my fingers slick with sweat. Slowly, carefully, I pulled back the curtain just a little. And I saw them. 2 small figures standing in the yard, bathed in pale moonlight. But they weren't children. Their limbs were too long. Their heads slightly tilted, like broken dolls. Their skin, pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over their bones. And their eyes. They had no eyes. Just empty, hollow sockets. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I stayed frozen, gripping the curtain. They stood motionless, staring at the cabin. Then, one of them took a step forward. The laughter stopped. I dropped the curtain and stumbled back, my pulse thundering in my ears. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. Silence. Then, the doorknob rattled. A slow, deliberate twist. I lunged for my shotgun, my hands trembling. I didn't care if it was just kids playing a prank. I wasn't taking any chances. The rattling stopped. I stood there, gun in hand, listening. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. As dawn approached, I finally dared to peek outside. The yard was empty. No sign of footprints, no sign of anything. But when I turned to the window, I saw them. Handprints, small, dirt-smudged handprints covering the glass. I left that afternoon. I didn't pack. I didn't clean. I just grabbed my keys and drove. I made it to a small town a few miles away and stopped at a gas station. An old man behind the counter saw my face and frowned. "You all right, son?" I hesitated, then told him what happened. His face paled. He leaned in, voice low. You're lucky. Most people who see them don't make it out. My stomach twisted. What are they? He shook his head. No one knows, but they've been here longer than any of us. And if they find you once... He trailed off, his eyes dark with something I couldn't place. I swallowed hard. What do you mean? He exhaled slowly. They may remember you. The air suddenly felt too thick, the gas station too small. I didn't stay in town. I didn't even go back for my stuff. I just kept driving. And as I checked the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. Because for just a second, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the road, watching me. A child, with empty, hollow eyes.